What camera should you buy? Now, in the 14 years that I've been doing photography and videography, this question has come up many times. Every single time I get asked this question, it's a very tricky one to answer because the answer needs to be kind of bespoke and unique to your needs. There's so many factors you've got to consider, such as your budget, what you're trying to shoot, what you currently have, and generally what ecosystem you would like to enter into. The reality is in 2025, you can't go too far wrong. You could buy any one of the camera systems and ultimately they will all do the job. There will be, of course, some nuance to each answer and to each camera brand. You could argue that Canon has a better color science, but that's not technically true at all times because there's been other tests where they actually say they prefer the Sony colors. And ultimately, you can color grade the image anyway. The Sony autofocus system is highly regarded, but it doesn't shoot open gate like the Panasonic does. So when it comes to the question, what camera should you buy? It just depends on what you would prioritize. They ultimately will all do the job. And I can't imagine anyone watching your videos would be thinking, that was shot with a Panasonic or that was shot with a Sony. For me personally, it's about the user experience. So you don't ever really know what is going to suit your personal style and your preference when you actually start shooting with each camera. So that's why it's always been a very difficult question for me to answer individually to each and every person who's asked me the question. I currently am within the Sony ecosystem and I shoot with Sony cameras, but that's only because that years ago I wanted a silent shutter in my camera and the only one that I could find that was full frame was the Sony A7S. I started then building up my lens collection and at the time Sony was the one innovating in the whole mirrorless world. Prior to shooting Sony mirrorless cameras, I was actually in the Nikon DSLR world, which kind of re-emphasizes the point about you kind of need to pick a system and pick a camera that will tailor to your specific needs. Why I chose to shoot with Nikon originally was just because my uncle had it. He had a Nikon D90 and that's how I got into photography. So I just kind of like made the easy choice to just stick with Nikon. But then just as I progressed, I realized I wanted different features and that's what led me to Sony. So I think that's probably my best advice to you and just get started really. The cliche answer in 2025 would be just to shoot on your phone. Everyone has a phone with a camera these days. You'll know after a while, after having created some photos and videos, what the limitations are of a smartphone. And then that may lead you to elevating up into an APS-C system or even a full frame. But ultimately, if you're actually perfectly happy with your phone, just continue with that. What prompted me to record this video was actually on set the other day, and I was shooting with a model, and then he started talking to me about how he loves this type of work. And he wants to get involved and actually start creating more content in himself. He showed me some examples of like music videos that he's trying to shoot. And then the only thing that I could see in those videos that I felt that I could have done with some improving was actually his lighting. So by the end of the conversation, we came to the conclusion he doesn't actually even need a new camera at all. He understood the idea of what type of shots he was trying to capture. He understood the editing, the transitions, the storytelling. It was just his lighting that was a bit off for me. None of the scenes had any lighting involved, and he wasn't utilizing the ambient lighting in the best possible way. So with that simple tweak of just being more conscious about your lighting choice and your lighting situation, that will elevate his work massively. Way more than shooting with a high-end expensive camera and lens setup, but then still have poor lighting. And just to sort of go back on the equipment that I currently shoot with, and that I've actually opted to shoot with Sony based off the needs that I had back in 2015. And I've kind of just grown with the system over time. However, here in 2025, if I had nothing at all and I had to choose a system, I'd actually probably lean towards Panasonic. And the reason why I want to lean towards Panasonic here in 2025 is just because that they're the only camera brand that I'm aware of that shoots open gate. Why open gate is important to me is because it would actually give me a little bit more room on the top and the bottom of the frame. So if I wanted to convert this to social, I can do. Converting to social from this 16:9 frame is just a little bit too tight on the center framing. If I was otherwise to recompose and pull back a little bit, it's not quite the same as if I was to be able to shoot this same distance and this same framing, but in open gate. But the reality is I'm currently heavily invested into Sony, and it might be a situation that Sony may come out with the open gate feature within their system. So in the meantime, I am just opting to continue using Sony given the fact that I'm just so heavily invested. And I'll just work around the need of having open gate because it's not a mandatory thing for me. But otherwise, to my understanding, the Panasonics are more or less performing just as good as a Sony in every other aspect that I would personally need. Sony have made advancements in the whole AI autofocusing system, and the new generation autofocus system is supposedly so much better. But I actually still shoot with a Sony A1 Mark I. So it doesn't even have the AI autofocusing, and I'm not really complaining about the performance of that camera. The reality is there's going to be a camera at every price point, and at the different price point tiers, you're making certain compromises. So just as an example, if you was to ask me what I personally feel is the best camera today in 2025, I'll probably come back to you and just say it's a Sony A1 Mark II, because that's the camera I personally want, but I can't afford, and that's going to be at the price range of many people. It'll be a camera that I feel confident taking on any shoot that I could possibly think of and get the job done. Going down the tier list, you start making compromises. Like if I was to choose the Sony a7 IV, which is obviously going to be a much more compromised camera than the A1 Mark II, I'd have to settle with the fact that it's 4K 60 in crop mode and it's not as high megapixels. Going further down the line to APS-C level, like the A6700 or the A6400, you're not getting the full frame look. You won't get that full low light capability. So there's always going to be compromises no matter what price point that you go with. So it just really depends on your personal needs and what you're going to prioritize. But I personally haven't kept up to date with all the possible camera options that are available out there to you today in 2025. But from what I have seen, you can't go wrong with any camera out there. Over time, you'll find for yourself what the limitations are and what you then need. But personally, if you are thinking about getting into photography and videography here in 2025, just get anything and get started, or even just start with your phone. My one piece of advice though is don't buy brand new. Wherever you can, buy from the used market. It might sound a bit scary at first about being scammed or buying broken stuff, but I would just highly encourage that you go used instead rather than new. Just because if you're buying at the used price, you've most likely got rid of most of the depreciation anyway. So if you do change your mind on changing the system at a later date, you're going to lose less money. Lenses overall as an investment, they still hold their value very well. However, camera bodies is where you kind of need to be a bit more conscious about when you're purchasing things. If you are unsure about buying on the used market and knowing how to inspect cameras for yourself, then maybe go to services like Wex Used or MPB. This is not a sponsored video at all. I'm not at that point where I'm fortunate enough to get any sponsorships, but I do use MPB quite a bit. So I hope this video has helped in some way help you kind of like navigate the decision-making process when it comes to buying a camera. But most importantly, I think the key thing is just to go out and start shooting. But otherwise, let me know down below what your first camera is that you've personally purchased in the past, or what your first camera purchase is about to be. But that's it from me. Cheers for watching.